All right. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first of 6 webinars over the next 2 weeks that the Center for Media Literacy is conducting in conjunction with NATO. I'm Monica Hanley. I'm an associate at the Center for Media Literacy, and we'll be exploring resilience through media literacy as the overall theme for these 6 webinars to help create a dialogue between NATO personnel, media literacy researchers, and practitioners. So our topics for the whole series include propaganda, mental health and social media, pandemics, news literacy, education systems, and NATO delegations and media literacy in government. For today's webinar, we'll be focusing on the current status of propaganda, including disinformation, revising historical narratives, current conflict narratives, and linking the role that media literacy plays in fostering resilience. But before we get started, let's introduce our 3 distinguished panelists for this topic. First up, we have Larysa Lacko, who is a NATO Counter Hostile Information and Disinformation Officer in NATO HQ in Brussels. She leads NATO's Information Environment Assessment Team in the Public Diplomacy Division. She is the primary advisor to NATO's senior leadership on strategy, policy, and strategic partnerships to enhance information environment situational awareness and counter disinformation. Prior to joining NATO in 2016, Larysa worked in the Canadian Foreign Service. Welcome, Larysa. We also have Dr. Nika Cull, who is a professor of communication at University of Southern California and is a scholar and educator in the field of public diplomacy, as well as a historian of the role of mass communication in foreign policy. He was the founding director of the master's program in public diplomacy, and from 2004 to 2019, he served as president of the International Association for Media and History. His most recent publication is the book titled Public Diplomacy: Foundations for Global Engagement in the Digital Age. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Nika Aleksejeva, who is the lead researcher for the Baltics at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab in Riga, Latvia. She is also a data visualization and data journalism trainer with a background in journalism, specific interest in identifying and exposing and explaining disinformation on digital engagement spaces in the Baltic states and beyond. She pays close attention to hostile Kremlin narratives about NATO enhanced forward presence in the Baltic states and Poland, the spread of disinformation about COVID-19, as well as Belarus political crisis in 2020, and malign information influence campaigns about the war in Ukraine. And her goal is to work towards building resilience to disinformation online, as is, I hope, all of our goals today. So without further ado, Ms. Lacko, we'll start the webinar off with you.
Great, thank you so much, Monica and team, for the introduction and for having us as part of this webinar. So speaking from the NATO perspective, NATO, of course, is a political and military alliance. The purpose is to guarantee freedom and security for all members through political and military means. And so our mission is fundamentally about keeping almost 1 million citizens safe and preserving and defending the Euro-Atlantic area. And we observe hostile actors trying to undermine this mission through a variety of different ways, including what we call hostile information activities and disinformation, in order to weaken democratic institutions and to obtain relative security advantages over the alliance. And so this term, hostile information activities, oh gosh, what does that mean? So we understand this term to sort of be an umbrella term for a combination of propaganda, disinformation, any sort of information manipulation with a deliberate intent to mislead. And so this is very much a challenge for us. And we've seen in recent years how there are real world consequences of this challenge. And so this is why NATO has a role in dealing with this challenge, because it is also a security issue. It's not just something for national governments to tackle. It's also something that in a NATO context is very important. So in terms of how we go about dealing with this challenge, we have a three-pronged approach. The first is enhancing situational awareness and understanding of the threat. The second is communicating with our public audiences and tailoring our communications and our messaging in order to reach them. And the third pillar is coordination. So working with other international organizations, working with civil society, with industry, etc. And so as part of this first pillar, enhancing situational awareness, so what do we mean by this? So as part of NATO's efforts to understand the information environment, the alliance tracks and monitors and analyzes information that's relevant to NATO's mission. And so ensuring that NATO allies have a thorough understanding of the information environment is critical. So this includes implementing measures and developing capabilities for one, understanding the hostile information activities that are targeting allied citizens, and also understanding, number two, the perceptions of our publics to determine whether or not these sorts of activities have an impact. And so NATO continues to use data as a strategic resource to inform evidence-based decision-making. And we've seen, of course, in this current changed security environment, especially as a result of Russia's war in Ukraine, we have been enhancing our situational awareness across the alliance to make sure that we all have a more deeper common understanding of the threats. And what we've been seeing for years now is hostile actors such as Russia systematically devising and deploying an emerging tradecraft of illicit techniques to mislead, to mold global attitudes and behaviors for the long term. And of course, we see this being done in support of geopolitical goals. We've seen around Russia's invasion of Ukraine, how, for example, Russia is demonizing Ukraine, undermining international support to Ukraine, portraying NATO and the West as aggressive. I'm sure my colleague Nika will go into more details about that. But those are just sort of some of the examples of hostile information activities that we're seeing. But ultimately, this sort of behavior goes against everything that we stand for, democracy, the values that we protect, etc. Maybe to go on to the second pillar, which is communicating with our audiences. This is our policy when it comes to countering disinformation. Proactive communications is key. We need to be able to tell our story. And so our policy is that our proactive communications need to be fact-based, they need to be deliberate, they need to be credible. When it's appropriate, we also debunk and counter disinformation, but the majority of our work focuses on ensuring that our own communications are credible and that we're able to tell our own story. And we do this through a variety of different means, including communications campaigns. Perhaps some of you have heard of our We Are NATO campaign, but that is a campaign that we rolled out years ago in order to raise awareness about the organization and to explain to citizens the benefits that the organization offers for citizens. Perhaps I'll also just mention in terms of allied responses, we've seen how allied declassified intelligence has been very instrumental in countering disinformation around Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we've seen how this has had quite an impact on, for example, Russian planning. And then finally, this third pillar that I mentioned earlier is coordination with international organizations. So for example, we work very closely with the European Union, in particular, the European External Action Service. We also work with the US Global Engagement Center. And here we're able to exchange insights with our colleagues who are also monitoring the information environment. I'd also like to mention that the Public Diplomacy Division, where I sit, we also have resilience grants. So allied and non-governmental organizations and civil society groups are able to propose projects and apply for grants that aim to build resilience. So there have been a variety of different projects, including media literacy projects and others that we've been able to sponsor. And also, you know, this word resilience has really become an important word in NATO vocabulary, especially in the last few years. So for example, even this month, the Secretary General addressed his first meeting with senior resilience officials. So there is an ongoing strand of work to continue to build resilience. For example, we have a number of resilience objectives that will be developed ahead of the summit next July. And so this is a very important strand of work that continues on in the building. And then maybe the last point I'll mention before giving the floor back to Monica is really the value that NATO brings in this space is being able to offer a platform for allies to be able to exchange insights, to exchange best practice, to be able to coordinate action. And so this is one of the ways that we are able to sort of bring everybody together and to share experiences and to help build resilience. So maybe I'll stop there for now and hand the floor back to you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. That was very insightful. And I have a couple questions, but I think I'll save them until everyone has spoken and then go into that. But thank you very much for that. And we'll turn it over now to Dr. Cull.
Hello. Well, as a historian, I guess my role is to say that we've seen it all before. And unfortunately, that's true. I do not see propaganda as some kind of moment in history that has suddenly burst upon us. Rather, I see it as an element in history that's always been with us. Media has always been abused, and since the coming of electronic media, it's been able to be abused on an industrial scale. However, as a historian, I'm very aware that there are moments of especial danger in the history of propaganda, and it's always worse when the media is new. We look at the greatest crises of the 20th century in terms of their geography and their personalities. So Hitler's war, the Kaiser's war, and so forth, Stalin's Cold War. But I think we could also look at them in terms of the way in which their outbreak is profoundly connected to instability in media and manipulation of the mass media of the moment. So you could talk about the war of the popular press, or the war the popular press made, which would be the First World War, the war that came from the advent of radio and newsreel, which is the Second World War, which made Hitler's power and distortion of German politics possible. And the Cold War is clearly made worse by the electronic media prevalent at its own outbreak. So this is why I also see media literacy as being part of the solution to these problems, and think that developing media literacy skills is essential. And I see education about media literacy as being one of the tools we have to counter misuse of new media, so that it's almost like an inoculation in public health, which unfortunately we all know a lot about nowadays. One thing I would say is that communication scholars warn us that media literacy isn't the only thing that you need. And part of the problem is something called the third person effect. And what this means is that were we to go through a course, like a national course explaining the power of media and people's susceptibility to propaganda and distortion, everybody would become conscious of it and worried by it. But we know that their primary worry would be how malleable their neighbor is to propaganda, not how malleable they are themselves. We always think that we ourselves have great judgment and are personally immune to propaganda. I'm one of the few people who doesn't, and I celebrate my malleability, but that's an unusual thing. Now, I was asked to go back to the Cold War and to talk a little bit about how disinformation was used in the Cold War. And the example I know best is what the United States did. They had a four-part strategy, and media literacy was part of that. The first thing that they did to combat the Soviet Union's reliance on disinformation in the 1980s, where it had become a central part of their global news strategy or media strategy. First thing they did was they tracked it, so that any new theme was known about within the United States government. They had a multi-agency tracking operation, and then they made sure that the US government was aware that this was going on, that it faced this kind of challenge to reality, where you had the Soviet Union claiming that the AIDS was an American bioweapon, that the US was trading in baby parts, that the US had created ethnic bombs that would kill one race and spare another race, or that the KKK was planning to murder black athletes at the LA Olympics. The US government had to be aware that these stories were out there. So they had a strategy tracking, then warning, and then educating the world, and where necessary, rebutting. But what was important about the educating strategy was that when USIA, the information agency's officers, went out to teach the world about Soviet propaganda, they would move the story to a different theater. So what I'm saying is the stories for Africa were presented in Europe. The stories for South America were presented in the Middle East. And what this meant was that it became very clear what the Soviets were doing, but it also became absurd. So a big part of educating elite audiences about Soviet disinformation was showing just how absurd the Soviet stories were. And when a disinformation story is tracked over time, or when it is exposed to the audience that it isn't tailor-made for, it often seems absurd. People think, oh my goodness, can people really be so gullible as to believe this? Can people really be so dishonest as to promote it? And we've seen that recently, the UK government's response to the Skripal poisoning, where they just collated every tweet that came out of the Russian embassy in London and publicized all those tweets on the same piece of paper, had exactly the same effect. It made the Russian embassy in London seem like a bad faith communicator. But the final strategy that the US used in the Cold War has been completely forgotten, and I'm not advocating it for right now, but I want NATO to keep it in the back pocket, and that is a strategy of negotiation. At some point, this is enough of a weapon that it needs a arms control process around it. And there is a moment when you need to say to your adversary, if you say X in the communication space, Y will happen in the kinetic space or the physical space. And the example that I always share about this is the way that the United States dealt with the AIDS rumor or AIDS libel, the claim that the US had created AIDS, was in April 1987 to have the Surgeon General of the United States confront the Soviet medical delegation in Washington and say, if you say this about us, we will suspend all shared AIDS research. And the Russians were aware, the Soviets were aware, that there was an escalating scale of sanctions, from no more AIDS research to no more scientific research shared with the US at all. And they really wanted to avoid that. And so the threat of real world sanctions in response to disinformation, well, the man in charge of the operation told me it turned it off like a faucet. That rumor went away. The confrontation happened in April. By August, it was gone. Other disinformation stories stuck around through October. When Gorbachev was confronted in December, he said the whole thing is shut down. It's a new day, no more disinformation. But that required a particular kind of geopolitical situation, and I don't think it's time to negotiate now with the Russians. But there may be other places in the world where we should be negotiating, and maybe especially with the small actors. Because I gather there are 36 countries currently practicing disinformation, with Bangladesh being the shallow end of the swimming pool, and maybe these are the actors who should be taken out of the equation by being confronted about bad faith behavior. Another part of this, which was part of historically part of a disinformation response or rumor control response, was demonization of repetition of rumors. And this is a World War II strategy. It became very clear during World War II that rumors were circulating, but research into the spread of rumors found that rumors correlated with intelligence, not with stupidity, that the most intelligent people were uncomfortable with gaps in the war narrative. So where the government was silent, people imagined an explanation or repeated a rumor that filled in that explanation. So this goes to something Larysa was saying about needing great and credible communication. You need to make sure that you're communicating so completely that that there are no obvious gaps for rumor to fill. And you also need to ask people to think, do I really want to pass on this rumor? So from World War II, we know those posters that said loose lips sink ships. The idea that the person who passed on a rumor was not an intelligent person trying to resolve the cognitive dissonance of news, but rather a foolish person seeking to build up their what do you call it, social capital by being a know-it-all. I still think there's mileage in getting people to think before they retweet. And this is what Nina Yankovic means when she talks about informational distancing. Last strategy, and is maybe the most controversial one, is that every now and again, our adversaries' disinformation about us flags a real deficit. So in the 1950s, when Soviet propaganda about the United States focused on racism, some of which included exaggeration of American racism and disinformation about American racism, the best response was not to say, that's not true, but rather to say, we are dealing with the elements that are true. And so both Kennedy and Eisenhower made addressing the civil rights crisis in the United States a priority, not because Martin Luther King was complaining, but because Khrushchev was addressing attention to it. So we should be careful. Sometimes I think we should seek to close genuine failings in our society and deny our adversaries' targets through that mechanism. So that's exactly 10 minutes. Thanks for inviting me along, and I hope there's something in there that's useful. Thank you very much.
Oh, absolutely. You brought up so many good points, and one of my pervasive questions we can get to at the end is that, like you said, we've seen a lot of these narratives before, like with the COVID, advent of COVID. I was seeing a lot of comparisons with almost verbatim the old, CIA invented AIDS. Well, they replaced AIDS with COVID and pushed that out. Like it was, just a fill in the blank kind of thing. So we can get to that a little bit later, but thank you so much. That was incredibly interesting. And last but not least, we have Nika, and I'm very excited to hear what you have to share.
Thank you, Monica, very much. Very hard to be the last speaker after so elaborate and exquisite speakers before me. Nevertheless, let me add my 5 cents to the conversation. And in my work, which is tracking disinformation and seeking out malign information campaigns, including foreign influence campaigns, I can draw a line between before February 24, 2020 and after. And of course, after, because we've seen many attempts of meddling Western democracies, it was just a matter of time before we see one that Kremlin potentially launches on social media about the war. And so end of September, we finally released research together with Meta, the mother company of Facebook, and a few other researchers. And we could see how, well, to cut to the chase, how sloppy the campaign was. So what the campaign was about. First, of course, we can't directly attribute it to Kremlin, but the narratives that caught our attention were against economical sanctions, especially the narratives that targeted Germany and Latvia, the country where I'm based in, were advocating for lifting sanctions against Russia, and narratives that were targeting France and Italy were talking about and advocating to stop supplying Ukraine with weapons, explaining that this is how these countries get into the war crimes, appealing to emotions, appealing to sentiment of regular audiences. So these were the narratives that caught attention. And then what really caught an eye was amplification of links that reminded legitimate, well-known media outlets in each of the country. Think of Die Welt in Germany, France 24, in ANSA Media in Italy, and others. So the creators of the campaign, they copied front end part of a web page, substituted text and images with their own stories that basically echoed the narratives that I just mentioned, and hosted them on spoofed domains. So if it was welt.de, the real domain, the spoof domain, for example, was welt.ltd. So shares some similarities. And then it was the links were promoted through social media posts. There were many, up to 2,000 assets involved on Meta's platform, thinking of Instagram, Facebook. On Facebook, these were both pages and user accounts. With pages, we could see that links that were shared were also amplified using paid advertisement. And those links that did not receive any engagement, so we corroborate the idea that those links shared that garnered some engagement were paid for. So there was almost no organic traction. Nevertheless, the number of assets involved and duration of the campaign was quite significant. Also, what we saw, of course, another red flag was the language error. Many of the posts were attempted to be in German, and we saw in the timeline that they shifted from targeting other countries to just targeting Germany. And after consulting with the German native speaker, we saw many language errors that a regular German speaker wouldn't make, but some expressions translated literally that are common, basically literally translated from the Russian language to the German language. So it was a giveaway. And additionally, with some contextual knowledge. For instance, there were accounts that had also a place where they live and place where they study. And in a few instances, the cities were mixed up. In one case, a person was studying in a city in Ukraine and then living in the city with very, very similar name, but in Poland, because pronunciation in Russian is the same. But if you try to create tag, these are two different places. So all these things gave away the inauthenticity of the accounts, but also showed the low level of both attempt to look authentic, and also probably some scarcity in resources, because we saw that these hundreds of pages that we and Meta uncovered as part of this campaign were very, very sloppy, meaning that they contained very little content, used logos of media outlets, or sometimes just some clip art images. Well, and so the main learning is that currently perhaps Kremlin is preoccupied by extinguishing fire that it created with its own audiences, meaning what they need to explain why invasion is necessary, why they continue doing it, despite economical hardship that is lurking over Russia, and other things. And perhaps they are preoccupied and don't have enough resources anymore, or at least that's not on their priority list. Another thing is attribution. So my first disclaimer was that we can't really tell that this is Kremlin, but we saw that these spoof domains are hosted and connected with resources that are hosted in Russia, registered using Russian phone numbers and email addresses. We don't know if it's Kremlin, but knowing how much effort Kremlin puts into controlling information environment, switching from kind of legal oppressions to even like more forceful oppressions, it's very plausible that this, like, Kremlin is at least informed about this campaign taking place. But the caveat with such attribution attempts is that historically we also saw that Kremlin benefits from all attributions that we give to it, regardless of how strong or weak they are. Because remember when there were US elections and the leaks from Democratic Party were kind of made public, and everyone were quick to jump to conclusion that these were Russian hackers, other leaks, and it creates this idea of Russia having eyes and ears everywhere, being capable of executing information campaign everywhere. Though in reality, I believe that that's not the case. But part of deterrence is creating image of being like greater power, including in information space, than it is. So this is, I would also love to take it for a discussion. What should we do? Because of course we all need attributions. Otherwise, our work kind of is left hanging in the air. So we need to answer the question, or at least try to answer the question, who did it? And of course, answer like, I don't know, which is very genuine. It's probably not the one that everyone is looking after, but aren't we creating like additional, aren't we adding more air to the fire that's already there? And finally, I wanted to address one of the propaganda tactics that we see probably very, very clearly, basically the denial or the mirroring tactics that Russia has used before, but also uses now. And learning from COVID-19 pandemics, we see how powerful it is. Because imagine two kindergartens saying, you are stupid, no, you are stupid. And someone from a side is listening to this very pointless argument. And the only two options are either one person is stupid or the other one. With COVID, vaccine is protecting you from the virus. No, vaccine is actually worse than the virus. So the factual basis is completely opposite, and you are left with no other choice and no other additional information to just choose between two, say, wrong options. Same with Ukraine. Before the invasion, Russia said that it would never attack. Ukraine said that it is preparing an attack. After the invasion, we all saw that Russia did full-scale invasion. Lavrov says, no, they never invaded at all. So we see this tactic, and as we know, part of disinformation, the aim of disinformation, part of it is not just give wrong information, but actually divide society. And if people have different sets of facts that they operate with, and then they come together and try to have a discussion, they have completely opposite poles of information, and so they can't agree, and all the emotions come in, including preservation of self-reputation and other things that come at play, and it becomes more personal. And of course, I guess everyone can relate to COVID pandemic discussions when we were, when a pro-vaxxer talks with anti-vaxxer. Same probably in, especially in the Eastern European countries, where like, did Russia have justification to invade or not? And so we see how these divisions are magnified using this mirroring technique. So again, Russia is not that good operating in other information spaces, at least not as good as probably it created image of while we were still learning what it's capable of. So that's coming back to the problem of attribution. And finally, the mirroring tactic that was very much splitting our society during COVID and is being used now when we're talking about the war in Ukraine. So these were my 5 cents. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Very, very interesting. And I love how all three speakers, there's sort of a cohesiveness in the messaging. And it, if I can start off with a couple of questions. So this is for everyone really, but you know, a lot of people have mentioned that the campaigns are sloppy. You can tell that it's not written by a native speaker of German or English or something like that. So if the campaigns are sloppy, if a lot of the narratives are kind of very similar to what we've seen in the past, either in the, you know, back in the 80s or even just a couple of years ago, why isn't it easier to combat this disinformation? And is this a role that media literacy can fill? I know we mentioned that governments or organizations, the more they communicate, the better it is, right? There are fewer gaps to fill in for people to go searching out answers that might be wrong. I know in Japan, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were looking at how they were communicating with their people, how they were communicating, and it was constant, it was every day, and we saw less of these conspiracy theories and things in Japan, whereas in some other countries it was a lot more because the government wasn't saying a whole lot because they maybe didn't have as much to say. So there's enhanced communication, there's debunking, which I mean, I think we all are kind of on the same page that debunking is kind of after the fact. I mean, there's pre-bunking, which is common, but it's sometimes hard to anticipate what the next disinformation thing may be. But that's also kind of more reactive versus responsive. And then lastly, media literacy's role in combating this. Is it a combination of all of these things? Enhanced communication, media literacy, debunking, pre-bunking, and kind of we can go around, and I'm curious to see what your thoughts are on that. Maybe Larysa, if you went first, if you'd like to step in.
Sure. So yeah, your first question. We've been seeing the same narratives. We can anticipate the narratives, but why isn't it easy to respond? So the narratives may, or the strategic objectives may have not changed over time that much, but the ways in which the actors behave to achieve those objectives have changed. And so, for example, obviously in comparison to the Cold War, we have a lot more ground to cover now. We have Facebook, we have Twitter, we have, GitHub, Wikipedia, so many different sites and areas where audiences are being actively targeted. So of course it's difficult, even though the narratives haven't really changed. And it also, GitHub and these different kind of sites, different corners of the internet, it's not something that we always have visibility over either. Group chats, so this stuff is going on there that we might not even be seeing. And so this is why, when I was speaking earlier about the approach that we take, it always starts with situational awareness in order to first understand actually where are the threats, what do they look like, because this needs to inform our communications and the way that we go about addressing the challenge. And then, yeah, of course, media literacy is one part of the solution. I think it starts with having the capabilities in place to monitor, to analyze, and then to communicate. Media literacy is also really important. We want citizens to feel like they have a role in countering disinformation themselves. When they read something online, yes, they can flag it to Facebook or Twitter if it's suspicious or if it's false. So equipping them with the right skill sets to do that is really important. And maybe just one more point, you know, Nika was talking about the sloppiness of the campaigns. I think we should be, you know, we can be exposing that more to the public, you know, taking into account what you said, Nika, about, you know, not giving them too much credit, because we do not want to make hostile actors look successful in this area. But pointing out mistakes, pointing out sloppy work might be one of those things that we can do to show our publics, hey guys, actually, it's not really working. And you know, here are some examples of how certain hostile actors have tried but failed. So I think that's something that we can keep in mind.
So Monica, Monica, if I could jump in on this, because I do think that, you know, research has a role to play here, and that we can expose both sloppiness and cynicism in the media campaign. And a good example is some recent research on the role of Russian websites in promoting divisive narratives during COVID and previous to COVID. For example, there's a well-known story in the United States about a American football player, Colin Kaepernick, and whether it's right to kneel at the beginning of a sports match. Now, if you look at the origin of tweets on the Kaepernick story, 50% came from Russian media space, but they're evenly divided as to whether people are for or against. And I do not think that there are an even number of Russians who care about I think that they were deliberately stoking both sides of the argument, and the same with the you know, so we're now looking 6 years ago with vaccine controversy, where there were Kremlin sites on both sides of that argument. So we need to know about that. And I think tracking these stories, talking about how we're being set against ourselves, it might actually get people to think, well, if the Kremlin wants us to argue, maybe that's a good reason to hear each other out and to actually start to have a different kind of approach to our political behavior to one another.
No, that's an excellent point, and that was something we were saying earlier, that identifying shortcomings can be a good chance to have that communication and to look more closely at things, because, you know, media literacy isn't giving someone a set of facts or a set of resources that says, you know, these are the approved resources that you must read and then everything will be true. It's giving people the tools to judge for themselves. And when you have campaigns that, like we were saying, they're not necessarily promoting one side over the other. They want people to be confused. They want to sow discord. They don't want, you know, some sort of grand truth.
And I think that this is one of the differences from the 80s, that in the 80s, Russia was, or Soviet Union was pushing a particular agenda. Today, they're not. It's much more trying to get people to question everything. Though a shift that we've seen with the war in Ukraine is that suddenly there's something that the Kremlin does want us to think about in a particular way. And so we've had the return to meta-narratives, to the idea the Ukrainians are Nazis, or right now it seems to be the big story is that war is bad and by resisting, by helping Ukraine, we're artificially prolonging a horrible war. And that's the narrative that's getting traction in the US, at least among left-wingers, particularly. Whereas Ukrainians and Nazis did not really take off with President Zelensky being Jewish. It just didn't, or part Jewish. It just didn't get nearly the traction that the Russians were hoping for. I should say, last point, and this goes to what Larysa said, the other thing that's different from the 80s is scale, that the US government calculated that at any time in any year in the 80s, early 80s, there were 40 campaigns underway. Now here, you could easily find 40 every day in different directions that are going on. They're much more random, contradictory, less well thought through than the campaigns in the 80s. It's more like comparing a slogan with a novel. So much research and preparation went into the campaigns in the 80s and generating scientific proof for the things that were being claimed. And we're not in that space today, but it's much more disruptive and at a much greater level of volume.
I have something else to jump in on with that. I was listening to an interview with Maria Reza yesterday. And she has a new book called How to Stand Up to a Dictator and Fight for Our Future. Another thing that seems different is the type of technology. Maria was talking about how these algorithms now basically build a clone of us who know us better than we know ourselves, and then use very specific techniques to push our buttons, and they are relying on our emotions to spread this disinformation. So I think that another part of this is a combination of the technology and the use of our psychology that just hasn't existed in the past. So if any of our panelists have thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it.
No, I think absolutely that's going on. But and pointing out that it's happening is part of the process. But I think that we're not just here seeing a process of living in the presence of Kremlin-sponsored media disruption. We're living in the presence of social media disruption and the power of that medium overall. And so there are two processes working. There's the if you like, the geographical media literacy to do with Kremlin-sponsored disruption, and then there's the general understanding of how we're being played by algorithms. And both of those processes are really important. And I think the more that we are, and this is a thing that came out of COVID, the more that we're better able to cope with living in the age of social media, the less malleable we are to Kremlin tools. And this is why 2022 was not 2014, where we were all over the map when the lies started coming from the Kremlin.
Yeah, and that has to. Oh, I'm sorry.
If I could quickly add to that, I think another big part of it is our own ego and ability to fight our own confirmation bias. Because indeed, there are so many playing grounds, as Larysa mentioned, and people are also proactively seeking more fringe media outlets where we also saw these kind of breadcrumbs of forged letters posted by burner accounts once in a while. And then say a person who feels smarter than everyone else finds this forged letter that no one has talked about because others kind of acknowledge it to be not true. But this person thinks, oh, you remember this feeling when the scientists during COVID times were looking for a vaccine, but then or a miracle cure. And then all of a sudden in Vermictin appeared this one study that suddenly kind of became and it was amplified by Donald Trump as well. So our ego to find, and of course we need to be curious, we need to seek out new information and contribute to discussion, but our biggest enemy in that endeavor is our own ego and confirmation bias that we are very poor to recognize, and it applies to me as well. It's just that I have this red flag, and before I know there are consequences for me. But for many people, if they post something online, there are no consequences. They can just get likes, shares, acknowledgements, and there is no risk for their reputation, only gains. And that's the problem. So one is like our self-reflection, and another like lack of systemic check and balance structure that social media is lacking. So as bold as you are, as nuts as you are, you can get more likes, shares, comments, retweets, and no real, I don't know, punishment for what you do.
This is the point of making of the World War II campaign, to demonize people who to give a kind of negative consequence to somebody who passes on rumors, to make that person ridiculous, so that you wouldn't get likes, rather you'd get eye rolls, and it wouldn't give you more standing in your community, but it would make you seem like a little bit of a nutcase. And I think we are seeing, we are seeing that, and certainly if you look at some of the themes in satire, that can help to negatively to have negative incentives for passing on the sorts of things you're describing. But it's an uphill struggle. I agree with that. It's uphill struggle.
Right. It's challenging for people to, I mean, I think all of us, we look at this stuff all day, every day, and we're still susceptible to a lot of things, and checking our own biases, and also ensuring, especially if we're in a role to promote or to communicate something, to make sure that we're not, we're empowering people, we're not somehow suppressing free speech. And free speech is different in the European Union versus the United States. The United States protects hate speech. We saw just recently Twitter was reinstating a lot of the accounts that were suspended due to disinformation, hate speech, all kinds of things. So it'll be interesting, or it already is interesting, to see what's coming back up, or what is new. And Nika, I'm sure you're either seeing it already, or you will be seeing it. So it's that balance of, well, how much freedom of communication should people have? Should people have the right to say whatever they want, whenever they want, governments and people included? So it's there's no right or wrong answer at this time. So I don't know. Yeah, Nika, have you seen anything yet with the reinstating of the suspended accounts? Any sort of rush of new narratives, or anything new?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I can't really comment on that. Don't have any good takeaways yet.
Okay, it's pretty new still. But how about Tessa? You've been soaking it all in. Any final comments or questions for us? Oh, unmute first.
I was reminded as I was listening of a group that I heard about in Lithuania called the Elves. And this is a fantastic group of citizens, ordinary citizens, who go online through social media, and they combat disinformation and misinformation. And it's such a powerful grassroots way of having people address some of these fundamental problems that we have. And of course, they're subject to manipulation, just like all the rest of us. And so I was really pleased to be hearing some of the suggestions that came out about the role that ordinary citizens can play, and how media literacy can make a difference, and that it is considered part of the strategic approach. So I guess if you have any other thoughts about media literacy's role, I would really welcome hearing what you're addressing.
I think from our side, you know, I was mentioning earlier about us being able to provide that platform for allies to exchange. And so this is what we have been doing. It's great to have all of the 30 allies sat around a table and sharing their own national experiences and how their own governments, how they're structured, what capabilities they have in place. And this includes also things like media literacy and how that is incorporated in the national approaches. So having allies share that information with one another to inspire action, just in the spirit of exchange of best practices is really helpful, and that's something that we're going to continue to do.
Great.
All right, if Tessa, if you'd like to share your screen again, the last slide there is promoting the next webinar, which is on Wednesday, the 30th of November.
Yes.
And I'll give you a sec to pull that up.
All righty.
And so that webinar is going to be about news literacy and empowering global citizens in a new information era, with Barbara Marankova, the director of NATO Information and Documentation Center in Kiev, Ukraine, Alice Hujet, if I'm saying that right, from RAND Corporation, Center for Qualitative and Mixed Methods, as well as Philip Sieb, professor at University of Southern California. So that should also be a very robust and interesting discussion, kind of tying together also what we've talked about today with more of the news literacy angle to media literacy. So with that, I'd like to thank all three panelists for being with us today, for sharing their thoughts and expertise. And I wish we had more time. We could probably go for hours and hours, but we will have to continue on Wednesday. So Tessa, any final wrap-up thoughts or anything else that you have to add?
No, I think we had a wonderful session, and I sure appreciated all the time from everyone to contribute to this discussion. And I also would say that many people in the media literacy community haven't really, I think, given a lot of thought to the idea of media literacy as strategic defense and the important role that it plays in defense and kind of the everyday responsibility of all of us as citizens. And so I'm just really thankful to have this opportunity to really engage in that dialogue with our community and help call attention to the very serious importance of all the work that we're doing. So thank you, one and all.
All right. Thank you very much. And it's the top of the hour, so I can let you all go. But thank you, and I hope to see you and talk to you again soon.
Yes.
Thank you.
Bye-bye
Thank you very
now.
much.
Thank
Take
you.
care.